Ian Newton's 30-year research into sparrowhawks is considered to be the most detailed and longest-running study of any population of birds of prey. The following presentation by Ian details some of his extraordinary findings from his research.
Well, as Paul explained, I'm going to talk about the sparrowhawk this evening on the basis of information collected over a period of nearly 30 years in South Scotland, but also in other parts of Britain. You're all, I'm sure, familiar with the sparrowhawk, but first I just want to give a few reminders of its natural history. It's a relatively small bird of prey, as birds of prey go, which nests in woods and forests, as many of you know, and it eats almost entirely other birds, especially small songbirds. And everywhere the bird has been studied, it's been found to be monogamous, at least for each breeding season. And the pairs nest solitarily, each pair well separated from other pairs. And usually birds breed in the same localities year after year. They build a nest usually about half to 2/3 of the way up a tree against the trunk, like this one. It's a fairly large, flattish nest, which is easy to identify. And the birds build a new nest each year near to old ones, so that you can easily recognize these regular nesting territories by the groups of nests of varying ages, because they last for years. And the presence of these clusters of old nests makes it possible to find sparrowhawk territories at any time of year, summer or winter, as you search through woodland. And usually the bird lays between 4 and 6 eggs in a clutch, so that you can have up to 6 young in a brood, and no more than 1 brood is raised in any one year. And in the areas where I've worked, about half the nests on average produce young each year, and the other half fail for one reason or another. But the proportions of successes vary greatly from year to year. They have good years and bad years. Now, not only is the species pretty common in Britain and Ireland, it's also one of our smallest birds of prey. And as I don't need to remind you, in birds of prey, the female is the larger sex. But in the sparrowhawk, this dimorphism is extreme. The female in the breeding season weighs about twice as much as the male, and linked with this size difference, the sexes differ in their feeding habits. The females take larger prey, or some larger prey, and they also hunt in more open habitat than the males. In addition, in the areas where I worked, the females have a higher annual survival rate than the males, so the females are longer lived on average, and this tends to give a surplus in females among birds of breeding age. Now, this is a map of Britain, as you can see, and the top area, labelled as Eskdale, that marks the area from which most of the data I'm talking about today came. But I'll also be using data from that lower area, Rockingham, which is in Northamptonshire, and also for about a dozen other areas scattered across Britain from north to south, areas that are not marked. Now, throughout Britain, as in Ireland, the sparrowhawk is resident year-round. It doesn't migrate. And the birds nest in large forest areas like this commercial forestry plantation, or alternatively, they nest in small woods or strips of wood and patches of woodland in open country. And every year in Eskdale, and this is a photograph in Eskdale, I searched all the woodlands in the area to try and find all the breeding pairs and record their breeding performance. That is, their laying dates, the date they start laying eggs each year, the clutch size and the brood size, and I also attempted to ring all the young produced. Now, in addition, each year, I trapped as many of the breeding adults as possible. That's an adult female. So that after a few years, most of the individuals in the population were ringed, and I was able to follow the same individuals year after year, in many cases through their whole lives. And females, as it turned out, were a lot easier to catch than males, so I have a lot more information for females than I do for males, as you'll see later. Well, one of the first questions we asked about sparrowhawks is, at what densities will sparrowhawk breed in different landscapes? And this is a map of an area in central Scotland. It's the Spey Valley, and the green areas on this map show the patches of forest, and the black spots mark the positions of sparrowhawk nesting places. And what I want you to notice here is the extremely uniform and regular spacing of the nest sites. And in this area, birds were nesting about 2 to 3 kilometers, say about 2 miles apart. And in every area in which we studied the birds over this period of years, we found a similar pattern of regular nest spacing. Now, this is another area. This is Clashing Darrock Forest in Aberdeenshire, in the northeast of Scotland. And again, the pins mark the positions of nests, and you'll see that they're regularly spaced through the forest. But here, the nests are much closer together than they were in Speyside. They're only about 1.5 kilometers, say that's about a mile apart on average. And in fact, in all 14 areas for which we have this sort of data, the nests were always uniformly spaced within woodland, but the distances between the nests varied greatly from one area to another. Now, to get a measure of nest spacing for different areas, I simply took each nest and measured its distance to the nearest neighbour. So for every nest in an area like this, I had a nearest neighbour distance. And then as a measure of nest spacing and density in the area as a whole, I simply took the average nearest neighbour distance. And it emerged in each of the areas we looked at that the average nest spacing was related to the local food supply. That's the densities of songbirds on which the sparrowhawks were living, with nests further apart in areas where their songbird prey was scarce. Now, if you look here, first of all, at the left-hand diagram here, the average nearest neighbour distance is plotted on the left on the vertical scale of the map, and along the bottom is an index of prey abundance. And each spot refers to a different area. And the abundance of small birds that form the food of sparrowhawks was measured by point counts, randomly scattered through the woodland in each area. Now, for a point count, those of you who have not done this, you select an area, a point at random within a woodland, and you go and stand there for a set period of time, say 10 minutes in our case, and count all the birds you can either see or hear. And then you move on to another randomly selected point. So get a number of counts, a large number of point counts for each area. And the average number of birds in those counts gives you an index of the prey population in that particular area. So the pattern is clear there, I think, in that as the densities of prey increase, that's as you move from left to right along the bottom axis, then the average nearest neighbour distance of sparrowhawks declines. In other words, the sparrowhawks were nesting closer together at greater densities in areas where their food supply was most plentiful. Now, the right-hand graph shows exactly the same data, but instead of the numbers of prey along the bottom there, that gives the biomass or the total weight of prey counted. But again, the relationship is similar. The greater the weight of prey availability in the area, per unit area, then the closer together the hawk's nest and the greater their breeding density. So it seemed then that in well-forested areas, the densities of sparrowhawks were related to their food supply. However, there are, of course, many landscapes in Britain and in Ireland that look much more like this. An open landscape where the fields are used by farmers for growing crops or grazing livestock, separated by hedgerows. And there's an abundance of small birds in landscapes like this normally, the birds nesting within the hedges. So there's plenty of food for sparrowhawks to eat. But the problem in areas like this is that there are no forest patches that are large enough for sparrowhawks to breed in. So in landscapes like this, the densities of sparrowhawks are held below the level that food supply would permit, simply by shortage of nesting places. And I put this slide in to just make a general point about birds of prey, in that under natural circumstances, raptors seem to be limited by two factors. One is the food supply, and the other is the availability of nesting places, and shortage of either one or the other can limit the density in different areas. Of course, if the birds were shot a lot or persecuted in some way, or if they're affected by pesticides or some other human-related factor, then that would be enough often to hold the population below the level that either the food supply or the nesting territories would allow. Now, providing the in any environment, in any area, providing the environment remains reasonably stable, the numbers of sparrowhawks we found nesting there also remains fairly stable from year to year. And this is a slide here that shows the numbers of nests or breeding pairs found each year in Eskdale over a period of more than 20 years. And the years are given along the bottom, as you can see, and the number of nests are shown up the side there. And you can see that the nest numbers fluctuated slightly from year to year. And the average number of nests in this area over the whole period was 34 pairs per year. But throughout the whole period, the birds remained within 15% of that average level of 34. Now, compared to the fluctuations that you find in many other birds, this represents a remarkable degree of stability. But that stability is typical of many birds of prey. But you only find that stability in stable environments. If some of the woodland is felled, for example, or if the supply of small bird changes markedly, if the birds decline for some reason, then of course the numbers of sparrowhawks will also change. They'll also change if somebody starts shooting them or there's some other sort of human interference. Well, how then does the population remain stable from year to year? What's the mechanism? Well, I mentioned earlier that each year I tried to trap most of the breeding birds. So each year I caught birds, some of which were already ringed, so that I knew that they were present in the breeding population in a previous year. But other birds were entering the breeding population for the first time. In fact, in each year, the breeding population, as you'd expect, consisted partly of old breeders that were present from earlier years and partly from new breeders that were nesting for the first time. And in this slide here, I've simply plotted the number of new breeders found each year, that's on the left-hand, the vertical scale, in relation to the number of old breeders from the previous year. And you can see that in years when a lot of old breeders were left, very few new breeders were added to the nesting population. But in years when very few previous breeders were left, then a lot of new breeders were added. Now, the average population over the whole period, as I mentioned, was 34, and that line on the graph simply joins 34 on one axis to 34 on the other. And that shows the relationship that you'd expect if the numbers of new breeders added each year exactly compensated for the number of old breeders that were lost. And those points show the actual figures obtained in different years. And you can see that all those points were close to the line. And that reveals the mechanism by which stability in numbers was maintained. And this is because the total numbers of territories in the area remain fairly constant from year to year. And generally speaking, a new bird can breed and enter the nesting population only when an old one dies or moves away and leaves a vacancy. So that's the mechanism by which stability in breeding numbers has been maintained, by competition between the birds for a limited number of territories that are themselves determined by the local environment, by the food supply and abundance of woodland. But it seemed in our population that there were always surplus non-breeders available each year to fill any gaps in the nesting population that arose. Well, I want to move on now. That's about how breeding densities are maintained. I want to move on now to a totally different point. And that is that over the years, I was able to record, obviously, the nest success in different years and many different females. But for exactly 200 individual females over this 30-year period, I was able to record in Eskdale the lifetime reproductive success. That is the total number of young raised by individual sparrowhawks during their entire lives. And my assumption was that all the nests of these different females occurred within this study area. Now, for the majority, the area itself was about 200 square kilometers. But for the majority of females, I think this was a reasonable assumption. But a minority of birds, a very small number, may have attempted nesting outside the area in 1 or more years, and hence unknown to me, but not enough, I think, to affect the overall conclusions. But when you think about this, if you're trying to record the lifetime success of a bird, the potential for bias on those estimates is quite large, simply because it's a lot easier to record the lifetime success of a short-lived individual than a long-lived one. This is simply because the longer a bird lives, the more difficult it is to keep track of it every year, year after year. So the first question I had to ask of my sample of 200 females was, how typical are those females in their lifespans of the female population as a whole? And the first point to make is that sparrowhawks themselves are not especially long-lived. The oldest bird in our study area, and in fact it was the oldest recorded in Britain at that time, lived to be 10 years of age. And the ages of the birds, as you can see, are given along the bottom there, and the number of females are given up the side. Now, the cross-hatched columns in this graph show the expected age composition of the breeding population at any time, that's based on our knowledge of the mortality rates of the birds and the ages at which they begin to breed. So those crosshatch columns show the expected age composition of 200 females based on knowledge of mortality. But the yellow columns there show the actual age composition of those 200 females whose lifetime success I knew. Now, there's no statistically significant difference between those two distributions, and this means that I can assume legitimately that my sample of females were representative in terms of their lifespans of the female population as a whole. In other words, that sample was not biased in that respect. Well, moving on, this slide shows the numbers of young raised by individual breeding females during their whole lives. The numbers of females are shown up the left-hand side there, and the numbers of fledglings they raised, that's to leaving their nest, are shown along the bottom. And that production of young, as you can see, varies from 0 to 24. Our star performer raised 24 young during its life. But if you look at those figures, look at the figure 0 at the left-hand end, about 16% of all those females attempted to breed. They laid eggs. They may have laid eggs in more than 1 year, but they still produced no young during their lives. They therefore left no descendants. And the remaining females, as you can see, produced between 1 and 24 young during their lives. Now, a lot of females, as you'll see, this is the peak, raised 3 to 5 young during their lives. And this was because most females, most broods consisted of 3 to 5 young, and most females raised only one brood during their lives. That accounts for the peak at 3 to 5. But the main point is that I want you to notice is that there is enormous variation in the number of young produced by different females during their lifespans. Well, what causes this big variation? Well, one obvious factor that I've dwelt on already is the lifespan of the individual concerned. And in this graph, the longevity of the different females is shown along the bottom there, up to 10 years. And that varies, as I said, up to 10 years. On the vertical axis is shown the number of young they produced. And each spot refers to a different female. And the general trend, as you can see, is that for females that are longer lived, they produce most young. But in any one age group, as you can see, there's a lot of variation. Now, if you look at those females along the bottom there that live to be 7 or 8 years of age, say they're some of the longest lived, some of them still produce no more young than some of the 1-year birds. And the oldest individual at the right-hand end that lived to be 10 years, that produced only 12 young, only half as many as the most productive female. But the general trend, as you'd expect, is that there's a relationship between the total production of young and the lifespan of the individuals concerned. Now, another factor that influences the number of young produced by individual females was the age at which they began to breed. Now, some females, like this one, begin to nest in their first year of life. And we know this is a first-year female because it's coloured brown on the back, rather than the grey-blue of an adult, of an older bird. But some females, we found, don't start to breed until they're 2 years old, 3, or even 4 years of age. And that's because the delay occurs because, as I've mentioned already, the birds compete for territories, and old birds usually win in precedence over the young birds. But it's also because in the case of females, because there are more females than males in the population, some females can't breed when they're young because they can't get a mate at that age. So as a result of these kinds of competition, the age of first breeding in some individuals is delayed, and that, of course, reduces their subsequent lifetime production of young. So, taking all this information together on breeders, together with survival up to breeding age, which we also estimated, I was able to calculate the total numbers of young produced by an entire generation or an entire year class of sparrowhawks. Now, the number of young produced by different individuals in each generation is shown in that vertical scale. And on the bottom is a percentage scale from 0 to 100% of individuals, and different individuals in each year class are arranged in order of their lifetime production of young. Now, the main point is that a large proportion of individual birds that live to leave the nest, they died before they could breed. 72% of the total fledglings produce no young. Another 6% live long enough to attempt to breed. They laid eggs, but they failed to produce young, and their eggs or chicks died, and only 22% of each generation of sparrowhawks produced young, but as you can see, in enormously varying numbers. And this 22% of productive birds in each generation produced enough young in their lives, not only to replace themselves, but also all the non-productive birds in each generation. Well, with a pattern of distribution like that, you can easily calculate that the 5% of most productive individuals, they're the ones at the right-hand end of the graph, only 5% in each generation produce 50% of the young for the next generation. So that's the kind of information that you can get by following the same individuals year after year throughout their lives. And given that information, we obviously asked the question, we couldn't answer it, but what kinds of factors influence the lifetime reproductive success? And we considered there might be 4 kinds of factors. Some individuals might breed better than others and produce more young because for some reason they're genetically superior in that particular environment. A second reason could be that they get something from their parents that's not inherited genetically, but they get some advantage from their parents. The parents may teach them to hunt or something like that, so that they're, if you like, silver spooned into the next generation. They get some advantage from their parents. A third possibility we've called accidents of birth. Some individuals might happen to be born in a good territory or a good year or have everything going for them in some way or another, and for that reason perform well in later life. And then the fourth factor is completely chance factor. The whole thing could be a random mix of factors. You can imagine that there might be a bird that had everything going for it, the right genes, the right accidents of birth, the right training from its parents, etc. but then it kills itself by flying into a window or something like that and dies at a young age. And thinking about this theoretically, we believe that the most important factor in influencing that lifetime reproductive rate is the last one, chance factors, and whether a bird lives or dies at each week of its life. But the other factors, we certainly can't rule them out. But we really don't have any concrete information on any of these. This is just thinking aloud. So, as I mentioned, lifetime reproductive success is one type of information that you can get from following birds through their lives. But another type of information is to look and see how the performance of individuals, that's their survival and their breeding success, changes during the course of their lives. Now, this looks a bit complicated, but it's absolutely straightforward. I'll just walk you through it. And on this slide, you can see there are 4 different graphs, and each graph shows a different aspect of the performance of the birds in relation to their ages. And their ages are given along the bottom of each graph from 1, 2, 3 up to 8 or more years of age. And if we begin with the left-hand graph there, that shows the survival to the next year of nesting sparrowhawks of different ages. And you can see that birds in their first year of life have less than a 50% chance of surviving to the next year. But as they grow older, their annual survival rate increases to the middle of their lives, say 3, 4 or 5 years of age, when they have about a 70% chance of surviving to the next year. And then as they get older still, their survival rate, annual survival rate, declines with increasing age. Once they get to about 8 or more years of age, they have only about a 30% chance of surviving to the next year, which is lower, much significantly lower than even the first year birds. Now, the other 3 graphs on this that you can see there show different aspects of breeding. Now, the first one, which is the second graph you can see there, that shows the laying date of the first egg in the clutch. And in the sparrowhawk, an early laying date is a good laying date, because the earlier the bird lays in the season, the more likely it is to produce young. And the young birds start laying quite late in the season. That's the 12th of May in their first year of life. That's the average laying date. But as they get older, they lay earlier, about the 8th or 9th of May. That's a very small difference, but it makes a big difference to their nest success. And then as you move through the lifespan again, they get progressively later. And the third graph shows the clutch size. That's the number of eggs per nest. And again, in their first year of life, they start off with quite small clutches, mostly around 4. But by the middle of life, they're laying 5 eggs per clutch, and then they drop off again in later life. And the last graph on the right-hand side, that's the ultimate measure of breeding success. And that shows the number of young raised per nest by birds of different ages. And you can see it's only in later, really towards the end of the life, do they decline there. Now, the shape of these different curves, as you can see, varies according to the aspect of performance that's measured. But all of them show that same broad pattern of improvement in their early years of life, which we can attribute to increasing experience or increasing social status, and that's followed by deterioration in later life, which we can attribute to senescence. Now, so we were quite excited to get these data because senescence has proved extremely difficult to demonstrate in wild birds. And this is because you can only age birds when they're very young, when they're in juvenile plumage. So you need a long-term study to follow those young birds through their entire lifespan. And the second problem is because so many birds die every year, of all ages die every year, very few individuals reach old age. So you have to begin with a very large sample of young birds in order to get enough individuals in the older age groups, enough to give you a statistical sample there. Well, so far then, I've talked about variation in the breeding performance and survival of individual birds. But I now want to talk for a few minutes about variation in habitat, and specifically about variation in the quality of territories. Now, in any landscape like this, where there are patches of woodland or patches of forest, you find a number, at least in South Scotland, you find a number of sparrowhawk nesting territories in the different woodlands. But we soon found that not all the territories in an area are occupied every year. There were always some vacant places in particular years. And over a number of years, I found that the available places were not occupied at random. Rather, over a number of years, the birds show marked preferences for certain territories that were occupied much more than you'd expect by chance at the population levels found, and they avoided other territories which were occupied much less than you'd expect. So in other words, I could statistically demonstrate that sparrowhawks had favoured patches of habitat. Now, the basis of this preference became apparent when we looked at nest success. Now, again, I'll walk you slowly through this table, and what it shows is nest success in relation to grade of territory. Now, on the left-hand side, that's the left-hand side column there, I graded all the territories in Xdale from 1 to 5, depending on how often they were occupied in a 15-year period. So a grade 1 territory was occupied in only 1, 2, or 3 years in a 15-year period, not necessarily successive years. And a grade 2 territory was occupied in 4, 5, or 6 years in a 15-year period, and so on through to a grade 5 territory at the bottom there that's occupied in 13, 14, or 15 years in a 15-year period. So this gave me a simple measure of the frequency of occupancy from low to high over a 15-year period. Now, the second column there simply shows the number of nests in those different categories of territory. And the third column, which is the important one, shows the percentage of nests that were successful and produce young. And if you run your eye down that third column, you'll see that nest success, the percentage of nests that are successful, increases as the occupancy of territories increases. So there's a correlation between occupancy of territories and nest success. In other words, sparrowhawks preferred to nest in those territories where their chances of raising young were highest. It seemed that they're very good at picking out the best bits of habitat. And the last column on the right-hand side there just gives another measure of nesting success. And that's the average number of young raised per nesting attempt in those different grades of territory. And you can see, again, looking at the figures, that there's more than a 2-fold increase in annual nest success between poor territories and good ones. Okay. Now, where you have a situation where some territories like that are successful and are occupied and produce young year after year, while others fail to produce young, inevitably you ask the question, is that high productivity of some territories, is it due to the high quality of the territories themselves, or to the quality of the particular birds that occupy those territories? Now, in the case of sparrowhawks, we know that it can't be attributed entirely to the birds that occupy the territory, because individual sparrowhawks tend to occupy territories for very short periods of time. Now, because the birds in the population were ringed, I knew how long each female spent on each territory. And this is graphs here showing these figures. And it shows, well, the females on the left, let's look at them first. And along the bottom axis is the number of years that individuals occupied particular territories. And most of the similar pattern for males on the right. And in both sexes, the majority of individuals were present on particular territories for only 1 year. But some were present on the same territory for longer, for 6 or even up to 8 years. But in general, we can say there was a very high turnover of sparrowhawks on territories, both males and females. Also, although in this area, some territories were occupied without break for a period of 15 to 20 years, this was obviously caused by a succession of different individual sparrowhawks occupying the same territory in quick succession, but most of them staying for a short time. Now, part of that turnover of birds on territories was due to mortality. More than 30% of individual sparrowhawks died each year, creating gaps for new birds to enter the population, the breeding population. But in addition, some birds changed territory from year to year, creating openings for other birds. Now, these are data here for individual birds that were caught in 2 successive years. So what we're looking at here is whether in the second year a bird was in the same territory it was in the year before, or whether it was in a different territory. So there's only 2 categories there for males and females. And you can see, just looking at both those little diagrams, that about 2/3 of all the females that were caught in 2 successive years were on the same territory from year 1 to year 2. But 1/3 of them had moved to a different territory, usually nearby. And the same pattern held in both males and females. So the question arose, why do some birds change territory? And to cut a long story short on this one, it seems that in this area, territories, as I mentioned, varied in quality, and birds competed over good territories. So that during their lives, many individuals started off in a poor territory, but eventually moved to a better one. The poor territories were occupied irregularly, mainly by young birds, which, if they survived, would later move to a better one. So these then are some of the strategies that are pursued by sparrowhawks to increase their own survival and reproductive success. And I've tried to emphasize in this the variation between individuals in their survival and productivity, and also variation in the quality of the habitat, in the quality of the territories that vary from poor to good. And both the individual quality and the habitat quality interact to influence the performance of individuals and to regulate breeding density. But I now want to turn to a completely different point and talk about growth of young sparrowhawks and sex ratio and survival of young. Now, I mentioned earlier, and you already know this, all of you, that females are bigger than males. And this slide shows the growth of young sparrowhawks in the nest according to their age from hatching up to 24 to 25 days of age. Now, the birds live, of course, stay in the nest a bit longer than this, but if you visit the nest after about 24 days, the younger are apt to jump out. So we stop visiting after that age. And the lower line on that graph is for males and the upper line is for females. And the sample for each sex is based on daily measurements of more than 100 females and more than 100 males. That data were collected by Dorian Moss, who was one of my students who studied growth and survival of sparrowhawk chicks. Anyway, that's his data showing you how the 2 sexes, they hatch obviously from eggs of the same weight at the left-hand end of those graphs, but they very quickly begin to diverge. And by the time the young are 10 or 12 days of age, you can easily tell the difference, whether they're males or females, by eye. The females are already bigger than them by that age, and they have much larger legs and feet. So you can sex them at about 10 to 12 days of age or older without any risk of error. Now, this differential growth in this way raised an interesting question. We knew that the young birds were competing for food, that food was scarce, occasional young die of starvation, so there is competition. So the question was, how do these smaller males manage to survive in the presence of sisters which are much bigger and stronger than they are? And we discovered, in fact, that males developed in behavior much more rapidly than females. The young males learnt to stand up before females. They learnt to feed themselves before females at an earlier age. They also learnt to flap their wings and to fly before females, and they left the nest on average 3 to 4 days before the females. So one way in which young males survived in the presence of big sisters was to keep one step ahead of them in development throughout. Now, when I give this talk in a lecture room, somebody always interrupts and draws a human parallel here. But anyway, I'll leave that one to you. But the sex ratio, a proportion of males and females in a sparrowhawk population at the time they leave the nest, is just about equal. This was a number of 651 broods recorded in this diagram here, and that shows the number of males and females, and the ratio, as you can see, is almost exactly 50-50. It's not significantly different from a 1-to-1 sex ratio. But I also looked at the sex ratio in broods of different sizes, from 1 to 6 in this diagram. The broods, as you can see, are stacked on one another from 6 young at the bottom up to 1 young at the top. And this shows, for each brood size, of course, you can have a number of different sex ratios. If we move down to the second line up from the bottom, broods of 5 young, for example, you can have in a brood of 5 young, you could have all 5 males, or you could have 4 males and 1 female, or 3 males and 2 females, all the way through to the right-hand end to 5 females. And the cross-hatched lines on this graph shows the frequency of different brood compositions that you would expect if the chances of any one young being male or female are equal. So that's what you'd expect on an equal sex ratio. And the yellow columns show what we actually found in nature in a sample of 651 broods. And there's no statistically significant difference between the expected frequency and the observed frequency, the yellow columns, in any size of brood. So sparrowhawk families are just like human families in their sex ratio. And if you're thinking of having 5 children, you might like to know that statistically you have a 3% chance of all those children being boys, or a 3% chance that they'll all be girls. And it's exactly the same in sparrowhawk families as it is in human families. So despite the size difference between the sexes of sparrowhawks, the ratio of males to females is equal, at least up to the time they leave the nest. But once they've left the nest and they become independent of their parents, their mortality, we found, is slightly higher in the males, giving in adult birds a surplus of females, as I mentioned earlier. Now, another question that we attempted to answer was concerned with dispersal. Of the birds that survived to leave the nest, we wanted to know how far they moved from their birthplace or the hatch site to find a breeding place of their own. How far did they disperse? And the next diagram here, you can see the one first of all on the right that looks a bit like a dartboard. That's a diagram based on ring recoveries reported by members of public who found our birds dead in the breeding season. And if you can imagine on that diagram on the dartboard that the birthplace of the bird is right in the middle in the bullseye, each spot marks the position where a ring bird was found dead in the breeding season and reported by a member of the public. And those circles, as you can see, are drawn at 20 kilometers and 50 kilometers. And the main finding was that most young sparrowhawks were found in a subsequent breeding season within about 20 kilometres of their own hatch site, of their own breeding birthplace. Some of them, of course, had moved further, some even more than 100 kilometres. But by restricting this analysis to birds reported by members of the public, I didn't bias the sample by including my own retraps in the study area, which would, of course, been biased in terms of short distance moves. Now, the left-hand part of that diagram there, the columns there, that simply shows the same data plotted differently. That gives the density of ring recoveries of sparrowhawks moving out in concentric circles out from the birthplace. So that gives you another measure of the extent to which individual sparrowhawks disperse from their birthplace to find a breeding site of their own. Okay, well, I'll come on now to the last point that I want to make in the talk, and that's about the annual mortality of sparrowhawks. Now, this diagram simply shows the number of sparrowhawks that died in different months through the year, from August in the late summer of one year through to July in the next year. And the columns show the number of individuals concerned. And this is based on birds that were found dead and sent to us by members of the public. This was to Monkswood Research Station, and over this whole period, a period of 30 years, we had a scheme there asking people to send us dead birds of prey so that we could analyse them for pesticide residues. And people sent in carcasses of raptors throughout this period. And we asked for all birds they found, however they died, because all we wanted was tissues for analysis. But this, of course, also gave us an opportunity to record the causes of death as best we could from a post-mortem. And that's what these figures are based on. But this mortality, of course, is not representative of all mortality. These are birds that happen to have been found by people. Many of them had starved to death, or they'd been hit by road traffic, or they'd flown into somebody's window, or they died from some other accident, some way in which people would have found them and sent them in. And we distinguish two main categories of birds here. Those that are in their first year of life, which is called juveniles, and adults that are in orange there. And there's also another category, the cross-hatched ones. These are birds that we couldn't age. And the reason we couldn't age them is that some of these birds were sent to us by taxidermists who'd removed the evidence of the bird's age. They kept the skin and sent us the body or parts of the body. Sometimes some people sent us only the liver, because this was the tissue that we needed for analysis. So we couldn't, there were always some individuals that we couldn't age. But what these data show, as you can see, is that there are two peaks in mortality. One is in late summer, in August, September time, just after young birds have left the nest and become independent of their parents. Now, this mortality affects mainly young birds, presumably because of their inexperience. Most of those birds are yellow. And the second main period of mortality occurs at the end of winter in February, March, April time. And that affects both age groups, both young and old. And most of that mortality, we knew from the carcasses that were sent in, is due to food shortage. Most of those birds were thin and had obviously starved to death. But of course, when you think about it, it's the end of winter when sparrowhawks are most likely to be short of food, because most of the mortality in small birds has occurred during the course of the winter, and the summer migrants have not yet arrived. So that's the time when sparrowhawks are most short of food and when they show most mortality. But nevertheless, there's still enough sparrowhawks left at the end of the winter, at least in our areas, to fill gaps in the breeding population. Well, that brings me to the end of the talk, but if I can just summarize the main points that I've tried to make for you during the course of it. The first point is that the numbers of sparrowhawks that bred in any landscape that we looked at depended primarily on the amount of forest, but within the forest, breeding densities depended on the prey supply. And sparrowhawks spaced themselves more widely in larger territories in areas where their prey was scarce. In particular areas, providing the environment remained stable, breeding numbers remained stable from year to year. Third point, concerning lifetime reproductive rate, only a small proportion of individuals in any one generation of sparrowhawks or any one year class contributed most of the young in the next generation. Another point concerns the age of breeding, in that during the natural lifespan of birds, both their survival and their breeding success increased up to midlife, and then were presumably due to increasing experience. And then as the birds passed midlife, their performance declined, presumably due to senescence. In any area, the quality of the territories varied, the quality of the habitat, and good territories were occupied much more than small ones and produced more young per nesting attempt. The very best territories were strongly competed, and most birds were present on individual territories for only 1 year, but some stayed for several years. But during their lives, many individuals moved from poor territories to good ones. The sex ratio at the time the birds leave the nest was equal, despite that size difference between the sexes, but later in life it became twisted towards females, which survived a little better than males. And most sparrowhawks in our areas settled to breed within, or with intent to breed, within about 20 kilometers, let's say 15 miles, of where they themselves were raised. And during the course of the year, mortality occurred in every month, but there were two main periods, one in summer involving mainly young birds, and the other in the end of winter involving both age groups. So they're the main points that I've tried to make. Thank you for listening. Right.
Why Sparrowhawks?
Why? Yes, that's a good question. Well, I got the opportunity at that time. That we're going back a long time now. This is half a century ago, in around 1970 time, when sparrowhawks had been very badly affected in Britain and in Ireland by organochlorine pesticides such as DDT, and they disappeared from large parts of the country. And it was decided in the organisation that I worked at the time that we needed to know more about the sparrowhawks and peregrines. Derek Radcliffe was working on peregrines at the time, but nobody was working on sparrowhawks. So I was allowed to work on sparrowhawks, which I had always been very fond of and knew quite well from being a kid. And I discovered one area. I heard via the grapevine that there was at least one area in southern Scotland that still had a good population of sparrowhawks, where they never really declined. And this was an area of pastoral farming and forestry plantations where pesticides were relatively little used. And I started working there. But of course, as the years went by, pesticides were gradually, those particular pesticides were gradually phased out, and the sparrowhawks were recovering it everywhere at that time. So that was the original reason for working on sparrowhawks, is that they were in difficulties from a conservation point of view, but they turned into a fantastic bird to get this sort of data from. And of course, getting a big sample for a bird of prey, that was really quite new. It's okay getting a big sample for a great tit that nests in nest boxes, or a blackbird that you can find lots of nests of, but doing that for sparrowhawks was quite a much bigger challenge. And the main first thing was that I had one or two helpers. These were amateurs in the sense that they worked in another line of work, but they were certainly very professional in finding sparrowhawk nests. And these people gave me a hand in covering areas and finding nests. And this was fantastic help and getting started. And we also discovered in the first year, or I discovered a way to trap sparrowhawks in good numbers. And once we could find the nest and trap the birds, then I knew that we had the makings of a worthwhile long-term study on sparrowhawk biology.
Excellent.
And was fortunate in being able to go on working on them for 30 years. I did a few other things, of course.
I know,
I
yeah.
consider myself quite lucky in that.
Did you ever expect the project to last that long? Was it
No,
set
no.
out? No.
Oh, not at all, no. Because I had a job, but I had to do other things. My job was working on birds, but I had to do other things as well as looking at sparrowhawks. But fortunately, I had full time on sparrowhawks for the first decade or so of this work, and that enabled me to look at sparrowhawks in different areas and make contact with people who are also looking at sparrowhawks in different areas. So this gave us all the data that involved comparing areas like nest spacing and so on. But then as I got less and less time to work on sparrowhawks and had to do other things, I concentrated for another 20 years on the sparrowhawks in one area in Eskdale. So all the...
Yeah, and just on that as well, you mentioned that when you originally started studying sparrowhawks, they were under immense pressure from these pesticides and other various reasons, but now they're quite common. Would you see any of your research into this bird of prey as in terms of like you know, over that period of study, was that a game changer in terms of the population numbers for sparrowhawks? The fact that these pesticides, or the knowledge of these pesticides, reduced, and that alone was the significant reason why they came back, or was there any other?
Yes, I think that's right, Paul. As the pesticides were gradually phased out, and of course we were monitoring that at Monk's Wood by the carcasses that were sent in, so we could see how the declines in pesticides in the bird's body were declining over the whole country at that time. And of course, I was collecting any unhatched or addled eggs in my study areas, and we were monitoring pesticide levels in those so that we could see that the birds were improving. They were getting less and less pesticides as the years went by, and they were recovering in numbers, and the breeding success was better. So yeah, we monitored that recovery, and as far as I could tell, it was entirely due to the phasing out of these pesticides, and they were back to normal in many areas by many parts of the country by the mid-70s, but in eastern districts, which in Britain is where most of the arable was and most of the pesticides were used, it took really until about 1990 before they were back in good numbers, and then they remained in good numbers. But since that time, other things have happened which have tipped sparrowhawks into Britain into decline. And I must say, I don't know about Ireland in this respect, but two things have happened in Britain. First thing was that small birds have declined because of changes in agriculture, and the prey on which sparrowhawks in much of the country are living are farmland birds, and that's just not, they're not as abundant as they used to be. So that could be one factor in decline in many areas. But the second factor of importance is that over quite large areas of Britain now, goshawks have established themselves. When I did this work, there were no goshawks in these areas, but now there are. And goshawks prey on sparrowhawks, and sparrowhawks also avoid goshawks. So when you have goshawks nesting in a wood, you don't get, in our experience, you don't get sparrowhawks nesting nearby. And as sparrowhawks colonized Eskdale in South Scotland, the sparrowhawk population went down. I only showed the period of stability until over a period of about 20 years, because after that, things happened. Goshawks came in and the populations declined. But that gave me a period in which to study sparrowhawks in which they were under no major predation. And so you could really see what would happen under those circumstances. But once goshawks came in, there were far fewer places in which sparrowhawks could nest in peace. The sparrowhawks nested, now they'll nest mostly in very dense woodlands where goshawks don't go or can't get at them so easily. But a lot of the places that were occupied by sparrowhawks years ago were now occupied by goshawks, and you won't get sparrowhawks breeding there any longer. So it shrunk the habitat available for sparrowhawks considerably.
And that goshawk, population increase, was that natural, or was there any sort of like reintroduction?
Yes, it was. I think it was entirely reintroduction or escapes of falconry birds,
Right.
because in Britain a lot of goshawks were imported from Europe by falconers. Some falconers would introduce 10 or 20 at a time in order to supply their friends and so on. And some of those birds escaped, obviously, are not recovered when they're used for falconry. And we've heard about some other falconers who deliberately released goshawks, imported them and released them in order to establish local populations for their own purpose in future. But anyway, the result of releases, deliberate releases and escapes, is that goshawks are now quite widespread in a number of different parts of Britain.
And what are your thoughts on that in terms of reintroduction of birds of prey?
Well, these are birds that should be in Britain anyway. They were in Britain until 100, 150 years ago, but they were shot out, mostly in the interest of game preservation. And because they are native to Britain, I feel quite good about them being back. In fact, I've played a very minor role in reintroduction of red kites to Britain, or England and Scotland, and reintroduction of sea eagles and so on. And so that's a good thing to do, to re-establish these birds. You may lose, or some smaller species may become a little bit scarcer as a result of that, but then you're reverting to a more natural situation anyway.